The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.
And the Institute is therefore concerned about Pan-African thought. By thought, we mean thinking, theories, thought patterns, voices, writings, paintings, creative art, whatever it is that people use to express the Pan-African aspirations and Pan-African interest in whatever part of the world, in whatever thing it is. So we are very interested in mining the thinking about Pan-Africanist thought, Black consciousness thought, Africana thought, all of those, Black feminist thought, Black queer thought, any of that, we are very interested in interpreting what are the permutations of it and what it is about and how could it be used today to explain Africa's conditions today and explain the possibilities going forward. So we do quite a lot of work that relates to Pan-African thought, from doing intellectual biographies of individual thinkers and what they thought across the world and what they continue to think, podcasts that are being done today, op-eds that have been done to convey that thinking by the young and the old. And the second part is conversations. And conversations for us range from this to book discussions, to book club discussions, to conferences, big conferences, to symposia, to podcasts, and other forms by which to community meetings, and other forms by which we have conversations, including via social media. We're very active on Twitter Space. We've run a lot of discussions in there. We are having a number of conferences that are coming in furtherance of that idea of conversations. On the 25th and 26th of August, which is next week, we're hosting a conference on SADET at 30. Which is the Southern African Development Community, born out of the Frontline State Initiative. So we are looking back in order to look forward. Accepted just over 80 papers that will be presented there. It will be opened by the former president of Zambia, and other former presidents will be present. Then on the 8th and the 9th, we have a conference on women and financial inclusion in Africa, looking at how the finance and economic system include or exclude women, from entrepreneurs to workers, to non-working people, to grant recipients, and so on and so on. We had just over 100 papers that were, abstracts that were received. That is going to take place on the 8th and 9th, and we look forward to a great conversation with the participation of UN Women, Commonwealth Women, Femnet, which is the feminist network on the African continent, and many, many others. Then on the 25th and 26th of September, we have one on technology and society in Africa. We are trying to understand that the roles of technology, positive and negative, on the African continent. And we just accepted 72 abstracts for presenters. We expect that to be a useful conversation about technologies, looking back into history and looking forward into the future. Not being naive about what technology can do, but also thinking about how we could make technologies work for us. Then on the 4th and 5th, we are discussing the unfinished decolonization process. The Chagos Island off the coast of Mauritius was not handed back to Africa during the process of independence by the British, they decided to hand over Mauritius, but it hold on to the archipelago of the Chagos and ended up expelling the Chagosians. They found in Mauritius and the UK and all over and all of that. So we're discussing that because the International Court of Justice has ruled against Britain that it should have done that. It should not have handed it over and it now renting it to the United States for the United States to use it for its nefarious war on terror. And lastly, on the 4th and 5th of November, we're discussing the African Union at 30 to be opened by former President Mbeki, which is looking at the where have we traveled, going back to the foundation of the African Union. So that's to illustrate that we do conversations and all of that. And this conversation for us, which we're having now, is part of our commitment to the understanding Africa from pre-colonial up to post-colonial, if there is a post-colonial. We're very interested in understanding the role and position of women to the extent possible from the perspective of women themselves. So this conversation, as we know it, is born out of a book which appears in the advert for this week, in the pamphlet for this thing, which is a book on the very subject of the thing, which is the role and position of women in the pre-colonial and post-colonial era. We've entitled it African and Afro Diasporic Women in Pre-Colonial and Colonial Times. And we have a lineup of 3 great speakers to take us through that, because I think sometimes we need to be reminded that pre-colonial women had a role and a significant role, and that we have a lot to learn from that, and about how these pre-colonial women defined their destiny. So without much further ado, I am going to hand it this way. I'm going to take each speaker that is in the program, and then we're going to do that. This meeting, we are doing it together with 3 other partners. The first partner is the South African Democracy Education Trust. South African Democratic Education Trust, and it has been doing what is called the Road to Democracy for a period of time, which is a series of books that are looking into how the road to democracy in South Africa was traversed, including the participation of others, including those in the international and African diaspora. Professor Sifiso Ndlovu is running that project and has been running it for a long period of time. I have been part of that project since 2001 or 2002, but I've been there for a long period of time, and I know that Professor Kiba has been part of that, and all the speakers actually are part of that great project. It is a project of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, founded as that right from the word go, driven quite strongly because of the belief that we need to tell our story. And of course, this project, that is supported by the National Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences, NIHSS, under the leadership of Professor Sarah Musuwetsa, and they are the great partners for us now. On our side is the Institute for Global African Affairs, which is a joint entity between the University of Johannesburg and the University of the West Indies in Barbados, that run this institute and are very interested in this project. Now, as I indicated, I'm just going to then to invite each speaker. So I'm going to start with Dr. Norma Thompson Tisani, who identifies herself not as Makulu here, not as anything else, but as an educator. She holds an MA degree in history from Birmingham University in the UK and a PhD at Rhodes University in Makanda. She has worked in the field of education for close to 4 decades, straddling history and higher education discipline. Dr. Tisane has over the years written and published academic papers both in history and higher education development. She has further developed papers, international and national conferences, and served as a consultant and an advisor to the Department of Higher Education. And in the past 5 years, she has served as a research associate, undertaking research and facilitating learning for an honors class at the Nelson Mandela University in Gqeberha, breaking new ground on the history of African women during the 19th and the 20th century. That's included the work of the figures like Queen Mother Sutu, Sarah Batman, Nosutu Chetelo, and among the 20th century heroines, it is Charlotte Maxeke, Nonteta Nkwekwe, Loretta Ngobo, and others. In her work as a historian, she is a keeper of memory, much in the same breath as Imbongi, and wearing the mantle of Umakul. Now, that is very important. I finally hear the part I wanted to hear. Yeah, and continued and change in Xhosa historiography during the 19th century and exploration through textual analysis. It addresses the fallacies in both history and the making of Xhosa history, thus presenting new lenses for the rewriting of African history. She has involved in extracurricular history initiative. She founded AA2 Imbali, a history program with a focus on excavation as well as preservation of oral history and stimulation of community history consciousness. And then she's also served in the history ministerial committee of the ministry. She cites, she has long experience in this way, from township school to a grade 12 learner township learners program, to working at Rhodes University, to working at CPUT, Cape Peninsula University of Technology. And in her work, she cites the Black consciousness and Africanist thinking, which influences her thinking, and is very interested in the rupturing of the hegemony of Western epistemology. She's passionate about that holistic thinking and all of that. And she is, of course, a wife, a mother, and a grandmother, and a member of the Amachawe clan, and Nkosikazi Ayiqedwa. I would like to invite Dr. Norma Thompson before I call in Mtandas to the platform. Siyavuya kakhulu. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Professor Zondi, for that kind introduction. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to engage with you this morning on so important a topic as we are. I actually feel that this is an august gathering taking place in the month of August. So we take off from the fact that this is the month of August during which we South Africans celebrate our grandmothers, Omakhulu, Onkhono, and we celebrate our sisters, daughters, abazalikazi, our mothers. This is the month when we should actually move from putting a finger on a particular event, but we should, as a nation, honor and respect all the great women that have traversed this land and that have influenced and informed where we are. Because where we are does not come from events that took place yesterday. Where we are is a result of what happened 200 years, 300 years. And for a long time, we've been told that we cannot go back and retrieve information on the history of the 19th century, in particular of the indigenous women. This has been really because Western historiography puts a finger on white males, and in particular in a colonial context. And even the white women are sort of come as some kind of addition. But indigenous women are almost just not there, because some of the anthropological thesis even denied the humanity of African women. So how can they come and be part of history if you even doubt if they existed at all? So this morning, I am particularly honored to be sharing my research on a beautiful, not physically beautiful, but just an outstanding woman, Sutu Mamtembo Khakhabe. We are talking about Southeast Africans who are Xhosa speaking. And the particular two groups are Abatembo and AmaXhosa in that sense. They are not different. They are actually more or less the same. They are the same. And that we are South Africans is even more important. But when we look at Makulusutu, which my students have come to refer to her, they just can't call her Sutu. When we look at Makulusutu, she's a princess of Abatembo, and she marries into the royalty of AmaXhosa, Amachawe. So Marxists will place her as having been of the aristocratic class, as having been of particular power. But in fact, her power did not just come from her birth. We're going to learn how her power, in fact, came from the society within which she existed. We're not going to be looking at the world of Makulusutu through the lens of a Marxist interpretation that is going to be identifying classes and will be forever be telling us about contradictions and tensions. No, that doesn't fit in this society in which she found herself, nor are we going to be in the liberal stance or space where we're going to be looking at human rights and sharing of power. Where Makulusutu existed, when she moved from her natal space to her marital space, this society into which she moved was multi-centered. It had many centered. It did not just have one big center where power and control was in. I'll just tabulate some of the centers of power within which she operated. Sutu's husband, Jinga, died in 1829. And from that death, Sutu moved into the center as a queen mother, because she was the mother of a 14-year-old young man called Sandile. So there was one center of Amaphakathi who had worked with their husband, Jinga. And so Lamaphakathi were loyal to the queen mother. But there was another center of Amabuto of Sandile, her son. They would be loyal to her as well. So her power was sort of dispersed instead of concentrated into one center. Then there were the royal women. She had to interact with her co-wives. She had to interact with the paternal sisters, or Dadobao, or Rakhadi. Now, when you look at the history on Zulu-speaking people Mkabayi. Mkabayi is famous, and her part was that she was a sister. She was a sister of the king, and she enjoyed tremendous power. So Makulusutu had to be working within all those centers and managing them. The point about power in these multi-centered areas was the goddess of balance, which is what Professor Ndlovu talks about. He talks about goddess of balance. The power is not just in one cup, and then the following day you will have a coup. No, there will be no coup, because the power is dispersed, and each is jealously guarding the other. It is taught, T-A-U-T, is pulled and balanced. But it doesn't mean that it was all Edenic or like paradise. Makulusutu did suffer insurrections from time to time. At one time, one of Nqika's sons, Charlie of Imincangatelo, these words are almost disappearing. We've got to get them back. Charlie of Imincangatelo died in 1842 of poisoning. But Charlie had been a hero of the 1835 war with his brother, Maqoma. And Charlie died mysteriously. And then it was said, no, it is Sutu. And she had to bear the threat, almost a life-threatening situation where there was a possibility of her being killed. But no, the power was dispensed. No one was going to kill the Queen Mother. The Queen Mother has never been killed, because if a Queen Mother is killed, then what happens to a son? The Queen Mother bears the son who is king. And therefore, the king, ikumkani ngunina. The king is the mother. Ikumkani ngunina. He will not be ikumkani without his mother. And Western historiography cannot conceptualize that. And in 2022, we have Smagade and Misizulu. Listen to that carefully. Listen to the discourse that is unfolding there carefully, because we are looking for ikumkani, but how are we going to get it? Are we going to get it because we are following the notion of primogeniture, which is the Westerners? Or are we going to be following the notion of a queen mother? How did she come about to be a queen mother? She comes about to be a queen mother because the people contribute ukulobola, and the people create their own mother, who is a unifying factor. And Westerners miss this part about this is a creation of an organic polity. They simply talk of the fact that, no, these were political alliances. No, it's an organic polity. The mother is the mother of all. And there is going to be a unity of these people. And that is where Sutu comes. The force and the power of Sutu, you see it best when you look at Sandile, who is 14. Sandile is lame. He actually has got a foot that he drags. And Westerners tell us that we don't take and we do not accept disabled people. But no, Sandile keeps his place. So does Makulusutu. And Sandile, when he eventually gets into power in 1840, he fights all those wars of dispossession until he dies in battle in 1878. And I say we need to understand the fire that Makulusutu lit in her son, who was disabled, to get over the physical disability and to stand up to an avalanche of European looters, adventurers, abductors of women and children, cattle raiders. They had to stand up to them. And Makulusutu never gave in. So if we talk of her, then we just cite up one or two instances where we see her power and authority. It will be the power of the military, because this has become a military age in a way that the indigenous people had never experienced. They had never organized themselves on military lines in the same way as they had to do now. Then, with the arrival of the horse and the gun, they also had to acquire the horse and they also had to acquire the gun, because they suddenly realized that this is the end of it. This is an Armageddon. And the worst thing that happened, just as Makulu Sutu took power as Queen Mother in 1829, the British killed the king in 1835. The assassination of Kumgani Yinza is just brushed over in Western historiography. Thank you. It's just brushed over in Western historiography, and nobody just sits down as to what was this spiritual assassination that had taken place, that a British boy called Southey could dare lay his hand on Ukumkani. And you can almost see her, how bewildered she must have been. If the Kumkani is dead, if the Kumkani is cut up as they did and took up his ears as something you show for victory and such desecration. So I think from 1835, it was real war. There was no option. And it is not surprising then that few, though the documents are, one finds that Sutu, the name, appears from time to time. And a character called Colonel Smith approaches her in 1835, just during the war, just as the king has died, just as they just cannot believe it has happened. And Colonel Smith comes to her and says, you know what? If you and I collaborate, I'll make him king. And he's referring to Sandile. And there is a recording of this conversation, because she says, he's king already. And Smith says, what's the point of a king without land, of a king without people? So in fact, they know what they're doing, eh? And Sutu says, if you let us be, and we keep our land, and we keep our people, we will be. That was the end of the conversation. Sutu lost her opportunity for her son to be made king. But the point is that from 1835, Sutu can see now that her son is going to be made by someone else. She's not going to be born. A Nigerian sociologist called Oyewumi has studied the traditions and the systems, political systems within her Yoruba society. And from her Ifa oracles, she comes up with a figure called Iya. And this is the supreme mother. Oyewumi takes off the notion of motherhood as being a biological responsibility. And she extends it to being a spiritual and a much deeper role around which the people are gathered. So it is that notion of Iya that I use, I think, around when I am looking at these women. When I'm looking at these women, now we go back to the military part. Spoga's Magadla at Rose University has looked at the women in the recent struggle. I call the 20th century struggle as a recent struggle, because the struggle has been. Now, when people misinform others, and give the impression that this is the beginning of history, it is not the beginning of history. Spoga's Magadla says, you have got to work very hard to find the women in the recent struggle. And this is the point that we are trying to say, that we are going to be finding the women in the earlier struggles, in the same way as we're going to be finding the women in the recent struggles, that this state of being was created by an ear, by the ears, those women who gave birth to men and women, to women and men, who would stand up at an avalanche in Amagato. Besides the military that she had to get involved with, the military that Makulusutu was involved in was not only in the shooting around. She had to take care of the women and the children in the cold, because they had to flee. The British would shoot anything that moved. After they had abducted a handful of women that they could look after, and thereafter they would shoot anything that moved. So the children, the women had to move into the forest. The food and the security and all that had to be the responsibility of Makulusutu and the women she worked with. In many records, the British will talk of there was a Sutu spy. There was a Sutu, because the women were moving around, checking where the British were, saying how many they were, how big that whatever army was, etc. And she would send some of these ambassadors to British camps, because the notion of war in an African context is not that of fighting to a finish. Akubulali ilike nembokodwa. There's going to be life thereafter. So the role she played in the military was not only supporting Sandile, it was also exploring possibilities of a negotiation. Now, you've got 1990. Then there were the negotiations that Sutu would initiate. But sometimes she would send these ambassadors and the British would simply take them and rape them. There was no respect. There was no military respect for, here is my other opponent in this military engagement. They would simply take them and help themselves. The other force that Makulusutu had to contend with were the missionaries. It was not just the military. There were the missionaries. And the missionaries had actually moved into the communities and established schools and churches. And she watched. I can imagine how she would have looked at how some of her subjects were converting, becoming abashumayeli, nomthandazo. She would have watched in awe as to what am I going to do now? And the missionaries were also gunning for the same. They were gunning for the royal sons and daughters. And there was one called Mata, one youngest son of Nega called Mata. And Mata moved into a mission station. That is how excited the missionaries were. And they built him a 4-cornered house. These things matter. Your house must not be round if you are converted. It must have 4 corners. It's a good sign that you are part of the civilized. The civilized have 4-cornered houses, and the not so civilized have got round houses. So Mata now has got a 4-cornered house, and Sutu moved into the mission station, and he says, come here. And there is a conference with Mata and Sutu and her Amapagati right at the mission station, colonizing the mission station and telling Mata to pack off. So she had the authority over her own sons and daughters. And okay, the others can convert, but not you. You are not going to convert. You are not going to be a Christian. You are not going to be one of them. And the other exercise I'm quite intrigued by is when they complain how they would try, the missionaries would try to divert the waters of the Kume. The waters of the Kume Mkai actually writes a long poem about the Kume. It's almost a holy river. These guys don't even know when they are treading on what? Sacred ground, sacred soil. They move in and they open up waters for irrigation. And Sutu says, no, that's it. You are not doing that. I remember this long complaint about the fact that Sutu had exercised her authority and stopped the missionaries from diverting the waters and opening up a fallow for irrigation. I can see how she just was all over, literally, from the military to the missionaries, to the politics within the polity, within family politics, and she held on to that. When the 1850 war broke out, 1850 to 1853, that was the longest, and they broke Smith's back, and they sent Cathcart, Amangesi, the good Cathcart from India. They had to have somebody stronger. And Payres writes and says the cattle had actually run thin from being taken by the British, and the indigenous people would come back and fetch the cattle. The cattle had lost weight from moving to and fro. That is how long the battle was, the fighting. And it was starvation, and they starved the indigenous people out. They would burn their fields. They would burn the crops within Izisele, where you store your crops. And it was starvation. And Sutu said, no, we're going to settle. We're going to come to some kind of settle. There was no settlement. They simply moved on and took the land. When the final war of 1877, 1878 broke out, Makulu Sutu was already quite aged because she would have been born at the beginning of the 19th century. So I can see her son, Sandile, on horseback, taking Makulu Sutu into a mission station because the war is imminent. And by then, the grand old dame was blind. And she was taken in there with one of her daughters, Magazi. And she spent her last days in this mission station. I would read another paper about the mission station into which she walked, because it was a mission station founded by Soga. Soga was Ipagati of Ngqika. So this son who had founded this mission station was actually Ipagati of Makulu Sutu. So when the British and the missionaries thought that she was moving into a mission station, but actually Makulu Sutu was moving in to be looked after by Ipagati, as was the role of Ipagati. And so we actually know when she died. She died in 1885 because Soga had sent his children to school. And when Makulu Sutu died, there was an article in Isikidimi. With Ipagati, the British don't understand the levels that continue to exist. And this is also what we must be mindful of, the resilience of African systems in 2022. So Soga, actually in Isikidimi now, he writes and he says, listen, all ye people of Kakabe, listen, all ye Yamagaleka, and you, Abatembu, your princess is gone. And you, Kakabe, your mother is gone. And that is how we know her date of death, August, by the way, 1885. Thank you.
You can give a hand again and ululate. You can ululate. Yeah, that was, I get so much there about storytelling methodology. the methodology of doing research where you do it by telling stories of people. In that way, you tell a story of a time and a story of a people. You also redeem them from a story as objects, and they become the subject of the story, the agents of change in history. And you've really revealed you kind of opened our eyes about Umakulu Sutu, the Queen Mother, about how she navigated this and exemplified what Professor Oyeronke Oyumi, who will be with us in January to May next year, visiting us, explains as a particular kind of an African motherhood. Thank you so much. Much appreciated. We'll put the two of you together so you can tell her what you thought about what you've just said. Thank you very much. That was interesting. I felt like I was with my grandmother, telling a story, but a young one this time, younger than that sister. Without much further ado, I invite Professor Sikiba Peter Lehwati, who is Associate Professor of History at a university that is bigger than our university. Our university is called University of Johannesburg. Theirs is called Witwatersrand. I don't know how to pronounce that thing, but it's Wits University. They usually call us a college down the road. And then we call them a museum up the hill. So he's been there and he's been with them from January 2000. Professor Lehwati is a white published scholar, especially on the question of the Ndebele people and their identity, and then on African language radio stations and listenership, on the role of radio during the liberation movement, especially Radio Freedom, which was linked to the ANC, on international solidarity, on African women and political authority, especially in the pre-colonial era. He has also produced some work on the politics of knowledge production and relationship between white anthropologists who would go and look at a story of Makulu Sutu and simply interpret the superficial part and not understand the big things. Between them and Black research assistants in Southern Africa, a hot political potato, as well as on popular struggles and resistance against apartheid. He recently co-edited a book, actually last year, on guerrilla radios. Guerrilla radios. Guerrilla radios in Southern Africa, broadcasters, technology, propaganda wars, and armed struggle, published by Wits University Press and RNL. He is currently completing a monograph on the politics of Ndebele ethnicity in South Africa, a very interesting area of study because Ndebele identity is a very shifting identity and all of that. Professor Lehwati, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Zondi, for those very kind introductions. You are a very generous man.
Yeah, we deal with vets people.
I was just in the archives yesterday, actually, in the William Cullen Library. And apparently, I think early in the 1930s, there was fire at Wits University, the Great Hall, or rather, the sort of this classic building that often appears when they talk about Wits on TV, appeared there, right? And apparently, at the time, Wits was called Rand University. So it got me thinking, Rao at some point was actually Randse Afrikaans University, but actually it's an appropriation. Rau, University of Johannesburg actually appropriates the identity of the University of the Witwatersrand, because that's where it actually comes from. So thank you very much, Professor Zondi, for those introductions. Now, my contributions to this book on African women and women in the diaspora, African women in the diaspora. It's two chapters, but in this presentation, I'm only going to focus on one. I'm going to focus on chapter 4. Even though the arguments that I'm making basically, span between these two chapters. The other chapter is actually on Ndebele women and political authority, but I'm going to focus on chapter 4, which is titled Women and Political and Ritual Leadership in Africa Since 1880, the Mojaji Rain Queens of Bulubedu in South Africa. And my story actually starts in the present. So it kicks off with the discussion of the current situation, or the situation as it was then about 2 years ago within Bulubedu. Within the Bulubedu monarchy. Now, the Bulubedu are actually situated in Limpopo province. So this situation actually started when the Bulubedu monarchy, the Mojaji Royal Council, actually ignited a massive controversy that grabbed the headlines when they actually took a decision. It was in mid-May 2021 when they took a decision to name Prince Likukela Mojaji as the Khoshi, that is the traditional leader of the Balobedu people. Now, in taking that decision, they actually overturned the statement issued by the secretary of the same council. So you have a council that is actually divided here, that the young Princess Masalanabo would take over the throne once she comes of age. So unavoidably, this pronouncement caused a major division between members of the Mojaji royal family. It marked a deviation from tradition, which threatened to effectively bring to an end a 200-year long custom, a 200-year long tradition, during which female rulers, that is the Mojaji Rain Queens, have been at the helm. So now the expectation was that Princess Masalanabo, who was then 16 years of age, she's now about 17 years of age, and she's actually the daughter of the late Queen Makubo Mojaji VI, whose reign lasted from for only about 3 years, from 2002 to 2005. So, it was, the expectation was that this daughter, once she turned 18, would actually take over the throne from the current regent, that is Prince Mpapa Mojaji, once she actually reaches majority at 18. However, the announcement of the Royal Council effectively meant that the princess was no longer in line to take over as the traditional ruler of the Balobedu. So the members of the Mojaji Royal Council argue that there were processes that had to be followed and not tampered with. Now, Masalanabo, they argued, had not undergone those ritual processes to prepare her to take over the throne since she was removed from Bolobedu. She grew up in Gauteng. She was removed from Balobedu when she was only 5 months old and had not been groomed within the royal family. I mean, clearly there was fear on the part of those that actually took her from Balobedu that if she's kept there, she might disappear. She might be poisoned, she might die. And that would be the end of it. So that's why, she was taken out for safekeeping. But then the Royal Council is actually using that against her taking over. So now their concern was that the challenges against their decision to disqualify Princess Masalanabo could end up with the throne being captured, okay? They say the throne would be captured by outside forces, by people who are not core members of the royal family. Now, besides, they argued, the idea of having men as rulers is not foreign to Balobedu people. Women have not always been in charge, and in fact, men ruled for the first 200 years of the kingdom's existence. Therefore, in their view, nothing prevented men from becoming kings again. So it was their turn now to take over and to put women to the side. Now, spearheaded by the patriarchs on a mission to overthrow a centuries-old tradition that has entrenched a line of female rulers of the Balobedu, the latest political intrigues are reminiscent of the manner in which some intellectual patriarchs in Southern Africa, in the region as a whole, have written women who participated in mainstream networks of power in the pre-colonial era out of history. So this is not unique to Balobedu. For example, Princess Mkabayi Kajama, the paternal aunt of 3 Zulu kings, Ushaka, Udingani, Nompande, played a prominent role in the politics of the Zulu kingdom as a leader of a royal Ikanda, and was singled out for accolades in royal Izibongo by the most creative bards, that is Izimbongi. Now, her praises reveal that she wielded enormous power over important customary matters in the Zulu kingdom. We are now made to believe that men control the first fruit ceremony, that is Umkhosi, performed in every homestead following the king's great Umkhosi, something which is a blatant distortion of the reality. In fact, during the reign of Chief Senzangakhona, that is Shaka's father, Mkabayi herself, in her capacity as the custodian of the royal Zulu mantle, presided over the ceremony. What we see here is clear evidence of how women leaders have deliberately been marginalized, silenced, and completely written out of history by intellectual patriarchs who have elevated the roles of male rulers. Now, the current political intrigues within the Balobedu royal family have brought into sharp focus the debate on women and political authority in Africa. Now, this debate has in fact been raging for many decades. So in this contribution, in this chapter, in this book, I actually analyzed the history of Balobedu Kingdom over the past 200 years. That is, I covered this whole period from 1800 when women came to power, focusing more specifically on female political leadership, that is, the reign of Mujaji reign queens. From 1800 through to 2005, when Queen Mujaji VI, that is Makubo, met her untimely demise at the tender age of 27 years. Now, this study probes the position of African women in politics, right? It looks at how scholars have represented African female political leadership in the pre-colonial and colonial periods. Using the Mujaji reign queens, it looks at how these women have actually been misrepresented, but how over time there's an attempt from current scholars, some of whom actually come from within the Mujaji, kingdom itself, such as Dr. Matola Motsekga, are actually beginning to rehabilitate, to look at these women in the way that they should actually be looked at, to put them back into history and to represent them properly. So I make a strong case for the extraordinary influence and authority in the political sphere of royal Balobedu women, in politics as well as in the sort of ritual sphere. That is where, their authority actually presided. Now, so these reign queens have served as a fulcrum on which the entire social, political, and economic structures of Balobedu society revolved. Now, these female rulers have been highly revered in the past and continue to be both feared and held in awe, both inside and outside Balobedu society and throughout the subcontinent, for the occult powers that they possessed. Now, the Balobedu reign queens did not exert their authority in the same way that Queen Makeda of Ethiopia led the army in battles. Neither were they like Queen Jinga, some call Nzinga, all right? The greatest warrior queen of Angola, who tactfully crossed and ultimately outmaneuvered the ruthless male-dominated power struggles against the Portuguese colonizers in the 17th century. Instead, their political power, that is the political power of these reign queens, was rather based on the mystic powers that they were known to possess, which enabled them to control the annual rainfall, withholding it when it was too abundant and provoking it when it was insufficient for the agricultural needs of the country. So the fame of the reign queens in the world of magic matched that of King Shaka of the Zulu, of Amazulu, and Mzilikazi of Amandebele in the sphere of warfare. So you can actually put them together. You can put them side by side. They matched in terms of their power and influence. When people talk about Shaka, there are those sort of ideas that come up about how brave he was. Now, when people immediately mention the name, the reign queen or the Mujahis, the whole idea of their mystic powers and the ability to bring about rain or to prevent rain, those are the things that actually come to the fore. And in fact, as this paper unfolds, you will see that groups from the region would actually go to her with presents, with gifts, would go to the reign queens, to Mujaji, to give her offerings so that she could bring rain to their parts of the world as well. So in this next section, I actually look at the literature review, but I will not go into details except to make a couple of just general points about how pervasive the power of women was in politics across the region, across the continent. Whether you are looking at North Africa, East Africa, the Horn of Africa, West Africa, Central and Southern Africa, you find that unlike how they've actually been represented, for example, by Western feminist scholars as beasts of burden, women have actually played an important role. As Umama has already spoken, I mean, in the case of Usutu, she clearly wielded a lot of political authority. And you do find these examples, whether you are looking at Nigeria, whether you are looking at Angola. I think I've made mention of Queen Jinga, Um, when you look at even in Southern Africa, I mean, you look at the case of Manta Dise, you know, the regent queen of Batlokwa, who actually led the people in the same way that Sutu came to the fore after the death of the male ruler. And you have this youngster, you know, Sikwanyela, who was still a minor. And so, you know, she had to lead, she had to provide political leadership. And it was acceptable within the Batlokwa society that when situations like that actually happened, it was okay for women to come to the fore to actually lead. But it didn't just end there. I mean, we know, we read about how Manta Dise not only provided protection to the mothers and to the children, but she was a warrior herself. She went into battle with some of her regiments. So you know, the past, you know, the past of Africa, the pre-colonial past, is actually teeming with vast examples of African women actually leading, providing able leadership. If I could just give two examples. In ancient Ethiopia, during the first 1,000 years before our time, that is at a time situated between the Trojan War and Homer, Ethiopia was the first country, not just on the African continent, but in the world to have been ruled by a woman, the legendary Queen of Sheba, also known as Queen Makeda. Ethiopia was second only to Egypt of the 18th dynasty under Queen Hatshepsut. Now, then there were the Candaces. Then there were the Candaces of Meru, the female rulers or queens who wielded considerable influence in the Kushite kingdom during and after the reign of King Argemenes. So, you know, the examples go on and on, but ultimately, it has to be stressed that in many societies across the length and breadth of the African continent going back into antiquity, women had a role to play in the public domain, both in the matrilineal and patrilineal societies. And royal women played important roles in different African societies as regents, as well as rulers in their own rights, and as warriors as well, who showed their valor in the battlefield. So I now want to focus, now that I've kind of given you an overview of the continent and how, you know, women played a significant political role that has actually been erased. And quite commonly how it's erased, it's often assumed based on the current powerlessness of women today. It's often assumed that if, you know, women are so oppressed today, you can imagine how pitiable, how terrible their situation was in the pre-colonial era. And actually the argument that I'm making here is that in fact it was Christianity, it was Islam, it was European colonialism that subordinated African women. It was these institutions that actually took away women's power and have put them in the sort of position of powerlessness that they are today. And by saying so, I'm not trying to create a Merry Africa kind of approach to Africa. I'm not saying that there was no inequality in the pre-colonial era. And I'm not saying that there was no patriarchy. I mean, Africa is a vast continent with many different societies, and it's constantly dynamic. So it's changing all the time. So you had matriarchal societies side by side with patriarchal societies. But what is certain is that inequalities between men and women were not as vast as they actually are today. Now, Very, very briefly, looking at the making of divine kinship and transition to female leadership amongst Balobedu. Female political leadership among Balobedu is an institution that has a particular history and context and should not be assumed to have existed since time immemorial. So it started at a particular time. And this is where we are at today. And this is where we are at with patriarchs in society trying to get rid of this institution. In fact, the male rulers presided over Balobedu polity for about 200 years from its establishment in the 1500s. So Balobedu actually came into existence in the 1500s before being displaced by the legendary Rain Queens who have ruled the Balobedu people in present-day Limpopo province from around 1800 to the early 2000s. Now, the core of Balobedu are believed to be descended directly from Monomotapa, that is in Zimbabwe, ancient Zimbabwe, that is. Now, the son of Monomotapa and his followers migrated, according to oral traditions, they migrated down from the region of Great Zimbabwe until they settled in their present abode in the northeastern part of the present-day Limpopo province towards the end of the 16th century. That is, it was in the late 1500s when they embarked on this migration. Now, upon arrival in their new home, the emigrants mixed with subgroups from the Sotho people, including the Lobedu, including the Pedi in the area. So there was a lot of different groups that they actually mixed with them, they integrated with them. They also mixed up with the Nguni of the southeastern coastal regions and the Shona from the area north of the Limpopo River. So this is a very mixed society, as indeed many societies are. So this notion of having perfect kind of monolithic group, it's an invention of colonialism and apartheid. You know, in the pre-colonial era, the borders between different groups were very porous and people moved back and forth across these borders. And, the rulers didn't interview and check which language did you speak to determine whether they should accept you as part of the group. That was not the criteria. The criteria was, were you willing to be loyal? Were you prepared to pay tribute? And of course, rulers were constantly looking for followers. And that's how we became so mixed. So we do not have perfect, perfect groups that are not mixed up with others. We are all of us, mixed groups. So there are different versions of how the Mujaji queenship came into existence. And one rather truncated and simplified version of the story mentions that the mother of the first Mujaji, that is Zugudini, who came from the Karanga kingdom, was forced to take flight from her home after her brother impregnated her. Now, with her mother's connivance, Zugudini is said to have stolen her father's rain charms and sacred beads and then headed towards present-day Balobedu. For the next 200 years, her descendants and her followers grew and prospered in the Daja forest. By 1800, they had established a large and viable polity and built smaller Zimbabwe-type stone terraces as place of worship. Okay. Now their ruler at the time was Mugodo, a descendant of Zugudini, distressed by infighting within the family, and driven by his desire to sustain the polity and to renew the declining rain-making powers of Balobedu royals, Mugodo's spirits advised him to eliminate his sons, in order to prevent them from killing him. And furthermore, the spirits counseled him to marry his daughter and have a daughter by her before he died, so that she, that is the daughter that he married, and her female descendants would become the rulers, thereby restoring the kingdom to its matrilineal tradition. So Dr. Matole Motshekga, Molobedu himself, as I've already indicated, an insider with very close ties to the royal family, agrees with the idea that Mugodo inaugurated the transition to female leadership through a father-daughter marriage. Now, this practice, according to Motshekga, is reminiscent of the Ramesside dynasty of ancient Egypt. So he says the connections are, far-reaching. They come from North Africa, they come from East Africa, they come from Sudan as well. So it's an ancient tradition. So according to this tradition, so Mugodo proposed to his daughter, that is Maselegwane, to bear him a daughter, pledging that he would hand over the prized rain charms to her so that she might succeed him as the ruler of the Balobedu. So Princess Maselegwane accepted the offer and bore a son by her father, but the little boy died shortly after birth, and some believe that he was killed. He was killed because they were looking for a daughter. So you couldn't allow, sons to actually take over. So the next child that Maselegwane gave birth to was a daughter named Masala Nabo, also sired by Mugodo. And shortly thereafter, King Mugodo died and was succeeded by Princess Maselegwane, who assumed the title of Queen Mojaji I. And that's how this queenship actually emerged. So Queen Mojaji I was in turn succeeded by her own daughter with Mugodo, and that is Masala Nabo, who assumed the mantle of Queen Mojaji II. Thus, the Rain Queen ascended the throne from about the beginning of the 19th century. And her fame, which stemmed primarily from her mystic powers of transforming the clouds into rain, was increased by the ritual which surrounded her. Her remoteness and inaccessibility to all, with the exception of a few of her subjects, magnified her reputation and made her to look larger than life, while her white skin was a major source of curiosity among Europeans. Remember, the beginning of the 19th century, that is when contact is beginning to happen with Europeans. You've got Europeans traveling and actually making contact with African societies. Your traders are coming into contact. So now this queen, that is the Rain Queen, she was considered by some to have been a woman of mixed white descent from West Africa. In fact, thank you very much. In fact, Queen Mojaji I was the original R. Rider Haggard's fictional work, She Who Must Be Obeyed. So works of fiction like Haggard's She powerfully shaped perceptions of Western peoples about Africans. Now, in this novel, Haggard informs his readers about a place on the coast of Africa, in a hitherto unexplored region, some distance to the north, where the Zambezi falls into the sea. That far inland, where there were great mountains shaped like cups and caves surrounded by measureless swamps. The people in this place spoke a dialect of Arabic and were ruled by, and I quote, a beautiful white woman, seldom seen by them, but had power over things living and dead. End of the quotation. So the novel tells us something about the violent silencing of Africans by a Western colonialist author. The Mujaji queens in Haggart's novel are white women who did not speak. This is a white woman who did not speak an African language, but she spoke a language based on an Arabian dialect. This viewpoint was based on social Darwinism and the unfounded race theories that privileged the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians, this is a creation, an imagination by Europeans. Phoenicians who are supposed to be light-skinned people, as one of the civilizers of Southern Africa. So if you look at early scholarships, including the time when Rider Haggard is producing his novels, there's a theory that is going around that the level of civilization and complexity seen in Southern Africa, for example, the great Zimbabwe ruins, copper mining in Musina, Mapungubwe and other sort of relics from the past that actually showed that, Africans knew about mining, they were involved in long distance trade, they were capable of, complexity, technological complexity. All these things could not be attributed to Africans. How could you say that these are creations by Africans? So they had to invent this race called the Phoenicians and attribute these developments to that particular race. And this is the context in which, in Rider Haggard's novel, you have these Phoenicians, this woman, this ruler, this who cannot be seen by the public, actually being a white woman. So when Rider Haggard defined the Mujaji Rain Queens as white women who spoke Arabic, the Anglo-Saxon author of romance novels on Southern Africa committed epistemological genocide against African women. It was about erasing Black women in positions of authority and representing African women generally as exploited laborers and slaves to the Arab-speaking white queen. So that Queen Mujaji could not be a Black woman. It had to be someone from outside because it's unnatural. How can you have, an African actually leading in this particular way? So the final part, and I'll take just a minute because I realize that I'm out of time here. So you do have then the encounter with Europeans. Whites come, and of course, the struggle is over the land. And clearly the Mujaji Rain Queens provided leadership. They entered into alliances with other groups in the area and they resisted. They resisted white encroachment on their land. They resisted demands by the Boer Republic of taxes. And there were confrontations. And so in the process of these confrontations in the 1890s, they got into the Mujaji Rain Queens, organized alliances with the local rulers, including Chief Makgoba. Makgoba, of course, of Makgoba's Kloof. The story is known about him as one of those rulers who was not only killed, and actually he was killed by the Swazi mercenaries who were in alliance with the Boers. And when after they killed him, they chopped off his head and took it. Parallels there with what happens in the Eastern Cape. So what actually happens is that when the Mujaji Rain Queen at the time, the next ruler, heard about this, she couldn't bear it, and so she commits suicide. She commits suicide because she couldn't bear to see her people being subjugated in that way. So the long and short of this is that women in African societies, and certainly in this particular society, the Balobedu, were able to provide political leadership. They were able to dabble into the public sphere in the same way that men did. And in this particular area, it became an established tradition, which still lives today, but as I've already argued, now the patriarchs within society are pushing back against it because they want to take over. And this is a matter that might eventually land in the Constitutional Court. And my hunch says that the Constitutional Court is likely to, take the side of women, because we are living in an era where there's equality between men and women, and there is this tradition, this long tradition of women actually having taken and presided over politics for a very long time. So in all likelihood, this matter is going to end up in the Constitutional Court, but it is ongoing now, because as things stand right now, you still have a regent, and it's a male regent that is in charge, while the young queen is still on the margins. So I'll stop here, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
Yo, hey, hey, this is deep. This is deep, Professor Lehwat. This is really deep. This is really deep. The number of stories that confirm stories that have been told about other places. Kwasi Kwarteng, who writes the book, The Ghost of Empire, says the enduring power of the empire was that it produces men and women who had an audacity of self-belief that enabled them to invent anyone, reinvent others, and cause others to disappear. So they would then create the Phoenicians to avoid that it was Africans. That's interesting, eh? Audacity to create, because they saw themselves as extending from God, and therefore had the same power as God to name a thing, and it becomes. That's huge, eh? Huge, that is huge. Yeah, this is really, really good. Thank you so much for helping us make sense of a huge story of the reign queens, after the political queens, after the motherhood queens. There are so many types for us to learn. Without much further ado, we end with our dear sister from Global Africa, from the diaspora, Professor Gary Augusto, who is a senior fellow of the International and Public Affairs, and was until June the director of undergraduate development studies at Brown University in the United States. She works on subjugated knowledges, science and technology histories and policies, and radical Black transnationalism in the United States, in Brazil, and in Southern Africa, and has published on all of these. Before returning to the United States for graduate studies and teaching, Augusto lived and worked for 18 years in Southern Africa, in Tanzania and Angola, and worked with SADET in its early years. From 1994, she participated in various public policy exercises in South Africa, including the National Commission on the Transformation of Higher Education and the first system-wide review of the Science and Technology Institution. She's a board member of the SNCC Legacy Project in the United States, and in Brazil is a collaborator with the Steve Biko Education and Culture Institute in Salvador, Bahia in Brazil. Her current scholarly work combines archival work, artwork, photography, where's the camera, to interrogate Black ecologies, landscapes, and architectures, including the gardens of the enslaved, and ephemeral sacral art in public parks, as well as textiles of the enslaved as both servitude and resistance. We are ready to hear from you, Professor Augusto. While she comes, let me remind you that the booksellers are here, exclusive books from Melrose Arch, and those that are online, we welcome you all online. We will be sending you a link about how to purchase a book. Thank you very much.
So I want to start by thanking Professor Ndlovu, my editor, and in particular for him asking me to make the contribution, which I think may be the only one in this volume, from the diaspora. So it's a heavy weight for me because the diaspora is not just the United States where I come from, but also Brazil, Colombia, the Caribbean. So I do my best in the chapter. I also want to thank Professor Zondi for inviting or accepting me to be a Letsima Fellow, which then brings me to the collaboration between SADET and IPATC, and I want to thank the staff members of IPATC for all their logistical work, intellectual work, and welcoming me. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, Sanibonani, Dumelang, Huyamore, Bon dia, and good morning. We start by, so we're going to travel across the waters. We've been in Southern Africa, but we're going to go across the waters a bit. We start by averring that among the technologies most important to humanity have been those used to produce apparel, clothing. The technologies for transforming fiber-producing plants into threads and yarns and then into cloth and clothing in the early modern era in Europe and during the period deceptively folding into a supposedly northern-based industrial revolution, have become a staple of the history of technology. But this is a history which also occurred in the age of race-based chattel slavery, of colonization of the Americas and of Africa, and of imperial domination in the Indies and of Southeast Asia. It's a history of technology which deserves a more globalized, multifaceted, and complicated telling, and one not just about England and India, or about the spinning jenny and the cotton gin, though all of these are important to the story. To accomplish this objective requires an interdisciplinary and a much more inclusive approach, a particular optic on what constitutes technology, and an understanding of why textiles may be generative for thinking about the history of technology in new ways. It also requires something else, an interruption, which brings in gender and race, placing them at the center of rethinking. Now, I've been thinking for some time about how to explore and interrogate the knowledges of Africans and Afro-descendant peoples who were enslaved in the Americas, but also in South Africa and in the Mascarene Islands, ways that are not just scenes of subjection and horror, ways that write and visualize them into histories, including histories of knowledge and histories of technology. Ways in which we might engage with their epistemic power and their cultural traditions, if you will, even in the most difficult, inhumane, and repressive of conditions. The field of history of science and technology is notoriously masculine. It's usually just all about men, focused on large technical systems, engines and railways and airports and computers and so on. And of course, it's very Eurocentric and it's very big capital centric. And yet, as African-American historian Tia Miles has argued in her persuasive and visionary recent book, All That She Carried, quote, our foremothers wove spiritual beliefs, cultural values, and historical knowledge into their flax, woolen, silk, and cotton webs. The work of their hands can lead us back to their histories. We have yet to uncover and recover more histories such as these, which present our ancestors as both minds and hands. This presentation will make a modest attempt to do so. It may be helpful to keep in mind what this type of work, that is history of technology, should do. It should, and I'm quoting from a very well-known text about this, the specific historical circumstances for production, circulation, appropriation, maintenance, and sometimes abandonment of a technology practice, in this case of textile technologies, by enslaved women, as well as it should illuminate the epistemic, economic, cultural, and political conditions of the technology's development. So this is the usual story you can gather by the images of histories of textile technology. It's about engines and cotton gins and spinning wheels. And this way of telling the history of technology not only leaves out women, and particularly Black women, but the historian W.B. Du Bois said it leaves out the fact that it was the labor, by and large, of Black people in the Americas especially, which brought about the industrial revolutions, which built those big cities that we know are famous for industrial revolutions. So the chapter that I wrote for the volume that we are celebrating today takes interest instead in a different set of things, in materials including the cloth that was produced for slaves to wear, called Negro cloth, but it also in cloth traditions, textile traditions from Africa. So aṣọ Ilona from what is today Nigeria, or lamba made in silk from what is today Madagascar, and so on. In doing so, we want to explore the symbolic meanings and social relationships that enslaved women, who were not just makers, they were not just wearers of cloth, but also makers of cloth, what they wove around the textiles that were integral to their involuntary servitude, but also to their other lives in Africa before captivity. This is a bit unusual because a lot of the social scientists say you can't talk about retentions from Africa. This isn't about retentions from Africa that just stayed unchanged from 200, 300, 400 years ago. What I think we have to remember, and the newer histories about slavery that are being written on that side, recognize that in slavery, the captives, in their enslavement, the captives were usually young people aged 14, 16, 18, and then in their prime, 20s and 30s. Obviously, these were not people who in their lives in Africa had been taught no skills, had been initiated into nothing, had nothing in their minds, and then they were just put to brute labor on plantations. The newer historiography of slavery is talking about not so much what they retained, but how they transformed and transfigured and reused what they had brought with them, what they would have brought with them from Africa. And so textile technologies are not different from that. So our history is a different one. We tell it, and I tell it in the chapter, as a coeval history. So it's a history that's taking place in India, in Africa, in the Americas at the same time, particularly between the 17th to the 19th centuries. The methodology that I use in the chapter involves tacking back and forth between, and in all my research nowadays, between archival investigation, photography, and art making. So the things that you'll see, not this particular slide, but the things that you saw in the introductory, and the other slides are actually art assemblages that I make as a way of thinking back and forth about these histories. It also involves what Saidiya Hardman, who is a Black feminist literary scholar in the United States, calls critical fabulation. She says that the archives are often with a lot of gaps. So what we have to do to overcome the gaps sometimes is to use our research-based imagination to weave certain kinds of tales and histories, and I do that also in the chapter. Another of other critical concepts from Black feminist theory and Africana thought bolster the way that I study these phenomena. Here I'll just mention a few. There is feminist theorist of visual arts, Tina Camp, and she has a notion about fugitivity or taking flight. There's a notion from the Caribbean historian and poet Kamau Brathwaite about marronage of the self, or how you can become a maroon in and of yourself if you are resisting in certain ways. And then there are South African feminist theorists and writers such as Habiba Badaroun, who writes about a notion of an African feminist imagination. And then there's the Afro-Brazilian literary theorist Leda Martins, and she has a very rich concept called Afrographia, or Afrographing, which has been immensely productive for my writing and for the study of many other people. These are images of several of the textile techno-tales, which is what I call them, that I've been creating. And 4 of those techno-tales, by now I think I have about 10, appear in this book chapter. So it was hard for me to decide today which one to share with you. I thought about this one, and it might have been in keeping with the theme of my fellow panelists. It's Queen Jinga of Angola, and I call this one Maquia's Tale. As you can see, it's bound up with the fact that historians have discovered that in her very rich wardrobe, she had imported cloth from what is today Nigeria. The cloth that she used was from the Ijebu kingdom, and it's a kind of cloth that the Oshugbo society used with some of their motifs. And I thought about this one because of my connections to Angola and Brazil, but that's not the one I'm going to do. I thought also about this one, which is sticks in my mind because of how influential the work of South African feminist scholars have been about thinking about slavery in the Indian Ocean and of course in the Cape Colony, and also the impact of some of the novels that South African women have written about slavery. So the novels of Rita Jacobs, Yvette Christianse, Maxine Case, and other South African writers who've taught us to think in a different way about slavery. And so I have one of the tales that's actually about Malagasy women from Madagascar and their silk weaving, which connects directly to the history of the Cape Colony. But I'm not doing that one either. And then, of course, there's a one that comes from my side of the ocean and the territory near where my 4 mothers come from. And this one is called Suki's Tale. And it's a tale about indigo dyeing and weaving, which starts with Hausa women, the Sokoto Caliphate, and their techniques for dyeing in indigo and weaving. But again, that's not the one I'm going to do. So I think you have to get the book to get all of them. And I'm going to do another one from the island of Martinique. I think people know probably a lot more about Haiti than they do about Martinique here. So I'm going to do a woman figure from the island of Martinique. But it may be worth pausing before we go on to ponder the many skills entailed in one of these textile technologies, sewing by hand using the implements of the day. In doing so, the practical knowledge involved becomes evident. Enslaved seamstresses had to understand the properties of different fabrics and of garment construction. They had to know about sources of dyes and their use. They had to be good at visual thinking. And by the way, I should say that they were used to, the young women who would have come over, or young girls, would have been used to dyes like indigo and all kind of natural plant fabric dyes. They get to the other side and they have to learn from the Native Americans. What are the plants that you can use for dyeing there? And also indigo was a plantation crop. So those who were working on an indigo plantation still could get their hands on indigo. So these seamstresses had to know about these dyes and their uses. They had to be good at visual thinking and able to do the mathematical calculations of sizing and patterning, adding and subtracting cloth. Even if they were not themselves literate or numerate, they employed heuristic strategies, songs, tales, and other things to learn about what they should do. They had to do all that was necessary to finish a garment: hemming, seams, darts, piping, buttons, embroidery. They couldn't often get beads, but sometimes they would even make up substitute types of beading to put in the garments. These were mostly garments that they made in secret for themselves, but they're also responsible for sewing the clothing of their fellow captives and many times for the plantation owner. They also had to know about the legal and informal codes about who should wear what. And this was an important element of their enslavement. These women who had come from societies, such as the societies in Southern Africa that we've known about, and all those traditions of how they could dress, very rich traditions, were suddenly condemned to wearing just kind of rough, homemade, colorless cloth. And they had to know what they could wear in public, or if they left the plantation, or if they went to the city, and what they could not. So throughout the southern part of the United States, and particularly in the Caribbean, one of the codes was that Black women could never have their hair out. They always had to have their hair bound up in cloth. Or they couldn't wear jewelry made of silver and gold even if someone gave them the gift of usually some master who had designs on them, the silver and gold, they couldn't wear them in public. So the person who's making dresses and making clothing had to be aware of all these kind of codes of what could be worn and what could not. The enslaved women often transgressed those codes, but that could be dangerous. Within these many social technical constraints, they still put creativity in the making of clothing, household linens, and decorations. In other words, they were especially knowledgeable practitioners of textile technologies. For the rest of my presentation, I'll focus on the story of the seamstress Lumina Sophie of the French-held Caribbean island of Martinique, and I'm basically skimming from the chapter that's in the book. Having an in-house seamstress, in other words, one who lived on the plantation in the French Caribbean or the French Antilles, added to the prestige of the wealthy plantation owner. Sewing for the slave owners' families was a major part of the Black seamstress's work. They made the elaborate wedding dresses and linens for the master and his wife and his children. They patched together and altered the cast-off clothing that was given to the enslaved. Some of the masters would send, or the enslavers, I should say, would send young apprentices, these are Black apprentices, to Paris to get trained in high-level dressmaking, haute couture, and bring them back. Why? Because then they could rent them out so that they could make these elaborate dresses for the colonizers, and the money, of course, would go back to the slave owner or the slave mistress for the most part. And sometimes it backfired because the young people who would go and get these extra skills from Paris and come back would run away. That happened also in the United States. There's several US presidents who had seamstresses who ran away, and none of them were recaptured. George Washington had one, Thomas Jefferson had one, James Madison had one. And you can see from the slave advertisements, they were trying for years to get these women back, and they didn't. But if one ran away and was caught, then she was either whipped mercilessly, or she was put to back-breaking labor in the fields. So she was no more a seamstress, but she was just someone picking cotton, coffee, whatever it was. In his magisterial novel, Texaco, Martinican writer Patrick Chamoiseau recounts the story of a character whose name is Esther Nom, and the character is his mother. And she is such a seamstress on an 18th century French plantation in Martinique. Chamoiseau captures perfectly the aspects of her pieced together freedom, revealing how important to her was doing the fine sewing for her fellow captives. So at night, she would secretly make these fine dresses for them, which was illegal, of course. And in his chapter, he discloses her hidden interior life as hand, yes, but also as mind and spirit, which she worked through cloth and color. In the chapter, I give a description that he gives of her daydreams, and sometimes she would actually dream about rebellion. Indeed, apart from the many who refused in quiet ways or ran away, there were also Caribbean seamstresses who took up arms, and we know a lot less about them, and they're a lot less publicized. Lumina Sophie was later known simply by her nom de guerre, her war name. She took a war name of Surprise, or surprise. She was that kind of seamstress. She was literate, having been taught in one of the very few segregated free schools run by Catholic nuns to give the rudiments of reading and writing to formerly enslaved or free Black girls. Working in slavery's wake, because she's born after slavery is illegal in the French colonies, what might Lumina Sophie have sewn for her clientele when she began working as a seamstress? Well, one of her products was actually an act of rebellion in and of itself, because as I said, enslaved women had been restricted in what they could wear. Of course, they had to be barefoot, that goes without saying, but restricted in the kind of clothing they could wear, the kind of jewelry. So when slavery ends, a free seamstress such as Lumina Sophie is free to just use her imagination to figure out and to make the kind of clothing. So there was a traditional ensemble that the enslaved women then wore after abolition, had 5 different pieces, and it was called a douillette. So she made douillettes. They threw away the simple, just rough clothing that they were supposed to wear, and they were able to make or else to buy from others clothing that was more to their liking. And they could wrap or unwrap their hair as they wanted to. Born in 1948, right at the dawn of the shadowy, incomplete freedom of post-abolition in Martinique, Lumina Sophie did not have the luxury of dissociating herself from the plantation entirely. She was also, like the bulk of post-abolition Black citizens of the French colonies, a cultivatrice, a farming woman, a category encompassing those farming their own small plots, as well as those who labored as agricultural workers, migrant workers, seasonal workers on the plantations, sugar, coffee, cacao, indigo, that were still owned by the French elite. In 1870, she becomes surprise, a fire-wielding militant. She was apprehended in the same year, imprisoned, and tried once that brief rebellion of 1870 was quashed. As a result, she was branded a condemned for life bagnard, or perpetual prisoner. Why did this young woman, born free 2 decades after the second and permanent abolition of slavery throughout the French colonial empire, a practitioner who could make a living, however modest, by dint of her sewing skills, why would she become a rebel? The answer may lie, as another Afro-Puerto Rican political anthropologist Yarimar Bonilla argues, it was the problem of freedom that came bundled with the problem of inclusion. Though slavery had been abolished in Martinique, the French colonial regime continued, and so did the oppression of its African-descended population. The immediate post-slavery period, Martinican historian Gilbert Pago argues, was just as violent, segregationist, and inhumane as under slavery. The insurrection that this situation provoked in the south of Martinique in 1870 was part of a wave of such uprisings throughout the French colonies and the British colonies in the Caribbean. There was a Morant Bay Rebellion in 1865 in what was then British Jamaica. There were many rebellions across the French Empire, including a massacre in 1868 in the Réunion in Saint-Denis, an 1871 insurrection in the Kabyle in Algeria, and an 1878 rebellion, the Kanak Rebellion in the Pacific, all of which were violently put down by European colonial authorities. And Bonilla explains that this abolition of slavery in the French colonial empire was really brought about because they were afraid about what had happened in Haiti. So I'm sure you know the history of Haiti and that first republic, Black independent republic, and also that ends slavery for the first time in the Americas. And they were scared of this. So they were passing laws to try to get around that. But they still had to make the colonies stay profitable. So the French colonial administrators, on the one hand, they extended what they said were universal rights, and on the other hand, the same coercion, compulsion, surveillance, etc., effectively enforced for the newly emancipated Black population that they continued for the most part to labor on the plantations. Looked at from the standpoint of African-descended women in Martinique, this matter had a steadily threatening everyday effect. Even the guarantees to bare life that were accorded under the old Black codes, or the French call them Code Noir, which the enslaved had come to regard as hard-won customary rights, were being reneged upon by the French plantation owners. These included the right to stay in those same little huts and homes that they had had in the old slave quarters, because once they were emancipated, they were let free, no capital, no home, no housing, very little money. And so it would be almost natural that they would assume that they could stay in those old houses and cabins where they had previously lived. But the new laws said that they had to leave them. So just kind of be set free to wander around the countryside. But perhaps the most important among the rights that these women were seeing imperiled was the right to what they call provision grounds and the cabin-side gardens. Raising one's own agricultural products had always been the key, not just to making sure that your family had more to eat than what the enslaver provided, but also to having something a little bit to market for money when that was allowed. And with that market money, you could sometimes purchase your own freedom, or that of your child, or that of your father, or whatever. So the ownership of the small cultivated plots that they and their ancestors had established and cared for was to these women, now supposedly emancipated, non-negotiable. Lumina Sophie, in her seasonal work as a farm laborer, was also part of that economy at the time that the rebellion broke out in 1870. Now, the opening bell for that rebellion was a widely publicized public assault against a respected colored man named Lubin. But there was also the matter of a particularly reviled and cruel plantation owner named Code, and he had sexually assaulted, beat up, and left for dead on the road a Black woman. And when it was taken to court, he received just a light fine. So you get all the combination of these effects, and this rebellion breaks out in September of 1860. The historian Pago says it wasn't a fight for Martinican independence. It was not the same thing as what went on in Haiti. But if we look at the archive about the language of the trials of people who were put on trial and the accusations that the angry and scared white property owners testified to in court, we can see what were the reasons for African descendant Martinicans' grievances, especially the women. They clamored for land, for dignity, and an end to racial discrimination. There was a small mulatto population, and they, despite the fact of having access to more education and to more formal training for vocations and professions, weren't allowed to practice those professions, or they had to frequent segregated public facilities, and they were daily insulted by the French colonial plantation owners. But for the masses of the free persons in the countryside, particularly women, their concerns centered on the concrete things that undermined their own quest for dignity and well-being after slavery. The unfair, often obligatory work contracts, go back to the plantation, work almost under the same conditions as before, the arbitrary seizure of the aforementioned gardens and plots, heavy taxes to try to force them into working, lack of schooling for themselves and their children, and of course being treated with contempt. Now, the words of these women are not part of the official record of rebellion, and of course their innermost thoughts during this period are not recorded. But the historian Pago argues that these women were the backbone of the movements and social movements and criticisms and reclamations of the now free enslaved. Lumina Sophie, whose work took her back and forth between toil on sugar and coffee estates, she hired herself out as a kind of a migrant laborer during the harvest season. And then she'd be in city life because she was a seamstress. From her teenage years, she'd walked almost daily around the countryside. She marketed products that her mother made, who was also a seamstress and who had actually taught her. Participated also in the work of mutual help with neighboring Black farming families, and she hired herself out, and she sold her garments in the towns that she had made herself. She became known in all this travel back and forth for her strong personality, her energy, her strength, and some say her attractiveness. She and her companion, Emile Sidney, had shared hopes of building a better life together. Both were to find themselves instead engaged in militant struggle by 1870. At age 22, some of the records say she was 19, and while she was then 2 months pregnant, she became the archetype of women insurgents. In the aftermath of the rebellion, which the French managed to quash, the male leaders who were captured, some eluded capture, including Lumina Sophie's, or Surprise, by then she's known as Surprise, her companion. The men who were captured were executed by firing squad, court-martialed, and then executed. But it was an interesting thing about the women rebels. For the French to have admitted that these women were rebels would have meant overturning everything that they thought about women, and particularly Black women. And Black Martinican women had poured out into the street to participate in the rebellion. They were juggling what was their expected traditional role of cooking and caregiving, but they also took up audacious initiatives. So they wielded bottles of pepper spray. They did the early version of Molotov cocktails. They spied. They set alight plantation mansions and the storehouses in town. Lumina Sophie herself was active at 3 different sites. She traveled many kilometers on foot, talking, mobilizing people, and fighting. And her entire extended family was also involved. 13 of these women were caught and tried once the rebellion failed. The oldest of them was 32 years old, and the youngest was only 17. Of these, the trial record shows 4 of them were seamstresses, and 8 were agricultural workers. Surprise, of course, was the embodiment of all these different kinds of occupations and identities. The men of the colonial tribunal believed that these women could only have been decorative camouflage, or they were dupes, or they were camp followers, so none of them were accused officially of conspiracy. 8 of them, all in their 20s, were charged with pillage and being arsonists, and they were condemned to perpetual forced labor. Unofficially, but made manifest at every point in the trial record, they were accused of being, quote, insufficiently creolized, of being too African. They hadn't become civilized. Surprise's own fate was sealed when, though widely recognized as one of the rebellion's leading lights, the court made clear that it was, quote, unthinkable that a woman could be a military leader, a plotter, or an insurrectionist. She was instead, and I'm quoting from the record, a woman who sought to dominate men. She was a blasphemer, and she was a pyromaniac because she destroyed 3 very wealthy Frenchmen's homes. Above all, she was to be punished for, quote, failing to conform to the image of sweetness, of submission to men, of being reserved, of staying in the background and doing her womanly duty, writes Pago. Her deportation was delayed until immediately after her son was born in prison in Fort-de-France. They sequestered the son, and she's sent on. Those who departed in 1870 for hard labor were sent to the miasmas of the French colonial penal colony of Cayenne, what later became known as French Guyana, one of the most infamous penal systems in the world. It was kind of like a Robben Island, but on land. And she'd be joined there by hundreds of other political prisoners, including anti-colonial Algerian rebels, as well as French women communists who had taken part in the 1871 insurrection in Paris. The death rate at Cayenne due to disease, ill treatment, underfeeding, and corporal punishment was above 75%. Surprise met her own death there after serving 8 years at hard labor. She had eventually been compelled to marry an ex-prisoner, a deported white Frenchman, and who augmented her physical abuse. When she succumbed of illness and maltreatment in 1879, she was about 31 years of age. In prison, Surprise also sewed, but this time it was for other prisoners. She herself was dressed until the day she died in a dull, heavy, uncomfortable black woolen dress, a cloth prison within prison in the tropical heat and humidity. In 1871, 6 months after the rebellion, state funds suddenly appeared back in Martinique to start 15 primary schools for Black children, and more swiftly followed thereafter. In Surprise's time, over 85% of her neighbors were illiterate, and one of their many unmet demands had been to have schools for their children put into their working contracts post-abolition. So Pago, the historian, insists the fight waged by Surprise and the insurgents of 1870 was not in vain. 1 year after Surprise's death, the General Council of Martinique, which was the French colonial governing body, requested and obtained amnesty for the rebels of 1870. Enslaved and free African-descended seamstresses in the Americas endured maltreatment, sexual abuse, and toil without surcease unless they successfully fled and were never found. But through their practices, their knowledgeable work with textiles, they also produced clothing of beauty and accessories of great style for themselves and for others. Some of them managed to ransom themselves, and many, even once free, never forgot sistren and brethren who were still enslaved. For a few, needle and cloth were briefly traded for incendiary weapons of rebellion. The figure shown here is an assemblage that I've created to celebrate the skeins and strands of young Surprise's astonishing life. I've tried in this chapter to entwine history, race, technology, and gender, work that remains to be done. I hope it also opens up possibilities for thinking in new or at least different ways alongside the work of my co-authors, 2 of whom were on the panel with me, taking what Professor Zondi calls an Afro decolonial angle about power and African and Afro-descendant women historically. Siyabonga.
Wow. Another round of applause for all 3 speakers. Absolutely mind-boggling. Absolutely mind-boggling, because you pointed it out, Gary, but it comes across in all conversation. They were talking about work that defied colonial aesthetics, notions of what is beautiful and how to create beauty and all that, of technology, notions, colonial notions of knowledge making, how you make knowledge, techno tales. Hey, I'm hoping my students are here and that they are noticing some research methodologies, techno tales as a methodology. It's absolutely decolonizing, absolutely mind-boggling. Photography, telling stories through a needle. I don't think my colonial upbringing allows me to understand it. Because it says I must create knowledge through a text and with words and stuff. That somebody writes a story, now I'm remembering that what I'm wearing, these beads, in my society, they mean something. When I pass it to Lehwati, I'm actually sending a letter. Hey, how did they all know this, which I know from KZN, and they also already didn't know it in Martinique, in Brazil, and so we've defied the whole colonial geography. I'm amazed, Lumina, Suki, and all of that stuff. And I'm just reminded that in Mgwenya, on our way to Nelspruit, there's a place called the Adams Calendar, which shows you the calendar of the people of this part of the world about 700 years ago, 400 years before the arrival period, and it shows the script they wrote by. It's still preserved. Here in Mgwenya, if you find a time, go see it. And she referred to in Sibindi writing of the Egbe people of Nigeria, to the Ngo script and other ideographic ways. Oh yeah, this is absolutely amazing. Again, I would like to give them a big round of applause. Even our social media is abuzz with this material. It is in this book. It is in this book. And these are only just 3 chapters in this book. And imagine if you go through all those chapters. I was seeing here, and I was talking to one of the authors because he was commenting a lot here. Dr. Manelisi Genge, who writes on Queen Regent of which nation? I can't. You see, you heard that. And then you have Chicha Twala, who also was commenting here, who is looking at Queen Mantatis of Batokwa that Professor Kiba talked about. And then you also have, of course, I've mentioned Manelisi Kenga, who's looking at the queens of the Swati. And then, of course, Sifiso Ndlovu, who's here, looks at the Queen Regent Mkaba Kachama, Kasenza Ngakona, Kachama of the Zulu Kingdom. So it's really massive work in this volume 9 of this, and I really think you should do yourself a favor and buy one just to draw from the stories that are here. Secondly, I think for those who are my students or consider me a mentor, to go in here to look at methodologies, there are various ways of writing, and then replicate it in yourself. I hope you watched the different kinds of presentations there, all 3 different, present in different ways. The first one was really storytelling, umakulu around the fire. And then the second one was the speaking from a choro and speaking into the nation. And the third one was a performer in a market, also telling stories through the tales. It's amazing. I hope you are noticing the methodologies, the approaches. I'm learning a lot out of this. Without much further ado, I'm going to let the audience now participate. I have a number of questions that I'm going to start with the questions that are online. I'm going to start with this question that is online. The first question is to Professor Lehwati. This one says, hey, Professor Lehwati, now sometimes Black people write the way they speak. So in English, this hey, we don't know how to describe. Is it a exclamation? What methodology did you use to access such wealth of knowledge? How do we, as young scholars, learn to access such knowledge in relation to things that we are trying to study from the distant past? Let us see by show of hands. I'm going to take a round of 5 questions, and then I'll take the next one. There's a hand at the back. We can take you. What is the next hand? Let's take that one first. Please keep it short, very short, no parallel presentation, and also introduce yourself by whichever way, Eurocentric way or African non-Eurocentric way. It's your choice. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Zondi. Can I also take the time for the other 4 that have not taken the opportunity right now? No, I'll be brief. My name is Simo Zulu. Thank you very much to all the presenters. This has been very thought-provoking and really, really encouraging for me as a young person to go back and study much about my own history and focusing as we have on women and their contribution in our own development, African development. And I'm very happy that the speakers talked of Princess Mkabayiga Chama. But before I ask the question, Chair, I would like to pay tribute to President Thabo Mbeki, who exposed me or some of us here to many of the African thinkers. And I'm happy that one of the speakers spoke about Reverend Theo Soka, who was reburied in 2011 in the Eastern Cape. And in that speech that he made there at the reburial of Reverend Theo Soka, he also talks about the historical role and contribution of people such as Reverend Theo Soka, W.E.B. Du Bois, S.K.M. Kai, and many others, including poets such as Nontsizi Mqwetho. And so, again, I said I will be brief. The speaker from the African diaspora, the presenter, said that many of us, or some of us, know less about Martinique as we do about Haiti. And I know of two thinkers from Martinique, Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon. I wanted to ask, or I would like to ask because I would imagine that she is exposed to the book, the notebook of a return to the native land. Does she feel that she is in her native land as she is with us here in South Africa and in Africa?
Yeah.
And lastly, with your presentation, I just want to pick up an irony of as you are talking about Lomina Sophie and many things that happened around her and other African women, African American women and the African women from the diaspora. The irony for me is the fact that the very proponents of racism who did things, including lynching of Africans, both men and women, could at the same time want to be intimate with the very same African women, to the point of impregnating them and keeping them hostage and having children and all of that. It's fascinating that you could have things like that happening, and it's not something that happened in the past. It's still happening now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Amma Bean here says, can each of these speakers tell us one inspiring aspect about the historical figure they have researched on? Just one inspiring aspect. Okay, that's fine. Let me see by show of hand another. I want to take 3 more. There is a speaker to the left, much appreciated.
Thank you very much. That was very inspiring. My name's Frederick Ogenga. I'm a Letsema visiting fellow at the Institute of Pan-African Thought and Conversation, and I'm from Kenya, from Rongo University. I just want, this is just a reflection. I'm really fascinated at the extent at which the narratives that I'm hearing here are resonating with what is an aspect and a big part and parcel of what is happening in Kenya. You know, in Kenya, the reigns of power have always been in central Kenya, around Mount Kenya, the story of Jomo Kenyatta and others. But I'll tell you the story of the Gikuyu. Because the Gikuyu and Mumbi were sons and daughters of God, according to Kikuyu mythology. So Mumbi was married to Gikuyu, and they had 9 daughters. And of course, if you follow the story of the Agikuyu, you see a maternal lineage. And Mumbi had 9 daughters, and those daughters are still reflected in the names, the surnames, the names of most members of the Kikuyu community. So this tells you really the centrality of women as far as power positions are concerned, that actually have been erased by the floods of history. And it is important really to retrace our footsteps on the genuine, authentic role of women in the society so that we can know where we are going as far as distribution of power and solidarity is concerned. So I'm really happy to be part of this conversation, and I really thank the speakers for sharing their most inspiring thoughts with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to Rati. There's one speaker. Thank you very much, Prof. Ogenga, for echoing the story from the side of Kenya.
Thank you. I want to ask a difficult question to each of the speakers. You know, and I'm asking this question. Sorry, my name is Tada Makoka, and I work in an organization called Umlando Wabantu. And I'm asking this question actually as a so-called colored woman who often feels like, you know, we are not really seen as African, as Black people. So I wanted to ask for all 3 of the speakers, what the impact of colorism is in each of those contexts that you guys were speaking about. You know, in the Caribbean for Dr. Augusto, in the Eastern Cape for Dr. Tisani, and then also, you know, what Prof. Lechwati was talking about, you know, the lighter skinned women living in Limpopo. You know, how did that impact on their relationships with other people in society? How did that impact on political relations as well?
Thank you. There you got the questions. I'm looking for one more on the in the far left, and I think. Oh yeah, I see. Yes, you have the floor.
Oh, I'm Professor Fidelis Allen, Lesema Fellow at the Institute of Pan-African Thought and Conversation. I want to thank the speakers, especially Professor Gary. Coming from Nigeria, coming from the Nigerian context, the women have played very important role in politics, in the public space, before colonialism. And colonialism only tried to take, or perhaps took, those powers that women had. But looking at the modern Nigerian state with multi-party democracy, increasingly women are shrinking in the elective public space. They are playing roles as supporters, as voters. They are also not able to support fellow women. What, in your opinion, do you think is a solution to this crisis. Lack of support by women, for women who seek elective political positions.
Yeah, that's Professor Fidelis Allen from Port Harcourt University in Nigeria, who is visiting us as a Litsima visiting fellow, and earlier it was Professor Frederick Okenga from Rongo University in Kenya, who's also a Litsima fellow at IPAC. Thank you. He's taking us to the current. Perhaps let's give the speakers an opportunity to comment, and if somebody can give them the mic, we don't have to stand up, and they comment briefly so that we have another round of questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chair. Professor. I'll try and follow up the questions. I'm interested in children's reading books. Actually speaking after my own heart, because when I retired formally, one of the things I did was to sit down and write children's books. And the strange experience is that I had no publisher. I could not succeed in convincing one publisher to take my works. And the work I had written, I'd actually written in isiXhosa, then translated into English. And this was going to be a reader for South African children, because there are children who cannot read English, but could read isiXhosa. And there were children who actually cannot read isiXhosa, and they speak English. And I thought these books were their books, and I didn't succeed in that. So that project has almost halted. I'd written actually about 25 short stories for those, and I just didn't come around to publishing them. And I thought perhaps this is a false trail I'm following. So, and then to take the last question from Professor Fidelis about Nigeria. But this question, I want to link it up with a point that Professor Frederick made. The similarities that they found in the presentations that we're making. And indeed, we have just got to celebrate our Pan-Africanism and not play games. This is very serious work, and we will discover ourselves through the IFA oracles from Nigeria, and we will discover ourselves from the situation in Kenya. They are the same. The guys who came here across the seas and came here, it's the same guys, and one never gets over the ruthlessness of one, just never gets over the surprise of the ruthlessness. When the account of Professor Augusto, the ruthless, the barbarity, and you run out of names to describe that encounter, which is what we've got to get ourselves out of. It is to get ourselves out of the noose that we cannot see anymore, but that is there around our necks. And that perhaps goes to the question about the Nigerian women. I don't think South African women support themselves either. And if you look at the politics of South African women, you wouldn't think it's the same women that were non-beings for almost 350 years, from 1652 to 1994. Because if there was anybody who was nobody, it was the African woman. And you wouldn't think we've got that. You would think that we would be wiser and actually recognize our strength. So I appreciate the point you are making about the Nigerian women and how we can support one another and all that. And I think there will always be this tension between, is it the gender issue or is it the national issue? But even the gender issue is a false trail, because the division of men and women in Africa is not the same as the division, the binary division of Europeans. So there's so much that still needs to be untangled. And as we loosen the noose around our necks, we must not be impatient with one another about the Nigerian women. The noose was so strong around our necks. I would like to be patient, not that there's time for that patience. I think let me keep quiet now before I overspeak.
Yes. About what is inspiring about the figure that you were analyzing?
What is it? Inspiring.
Inspiring about Queen Mother Sutu.
What inspires me about her?
Yes.
Yes. I almost know her. I don't believe her spirit. I don't believe the fire she lit. She lit a fire. Perhaps I was not understood when I said that. She lit a fire inside her son, who was lame, who could lead the warriors for more than 40 decades, who actually dies in battle. I don't believe the fire. It is the fire inside her that inspires. And I could be 18 again and start again and take on the fire of Makulu Sutu. But this is my daughter next to me. She's going to kill me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Makulu. Thank you.
Okay.
Skibaki.
Thank you so much for those great questions. And I think the discussion as well from the people on, is it Zoom that we are using? It's very, very interesting. I'll respond to about 3 questions. The first one is about methodology. What methodology did I use? So it's critical discourse analysis. I look at the texts written by others. So I drew on the anthropological text produced by, the anthropologists, the Griches, who actually spent about a year. This is what is actually involved in anthropology, immersing yourself in the subject of your story, living amongst them, and participating in everything that they are doing, and then telling their story. So the Griches, these are white South African scholars, husband and wife. They went and lived among the Balobedu and wrote a very influential text, which remains very authoritative. If you are going to write anything about Balobedu, you cannot afford not to read that text. Not to say it doesn't have its flaws, it does, but then, it's for you, I suppose, as a scholar, as a reader, to kind of see what some of those flaws are. In fact, even Dr. Motsekga himself, Matole Motsekga, read this text, the realm, that is the title, The Realm of the Rain Queen, quite extensively. He relies on it quite extensively. What I would have actually liked to do, had time permitted, was to actually go to Balobedu and conduct my own interviews. In my own work, generally, I tend to like to integrate oral texts into my story. But I also, do everything quite critically, because oral texts, what we see as oral text today, draw so much from the written archive. So, the boundary between the written and the oral, it's thin, if still existent at all. So quite often people who tell you that they are telling you oral accounts, quite often they actually have a copy of, in this particular case, they would have a copy of the Griches under their arm. and that is their source. But nevertheless, they are telling you oral accounts. So ultimately, I think, one needs to use both, but I think I was too pressed for time not to conduct my own interviews. I would have loved to do that. So and then there's the question of, accessibility, especially, writing of books that are accessible, children's books. I think it's very important. I don't have that skill myself to write children's books, but there are people who are writing children's books, such as, Nomalanga Mkhize, who is a young scholar, a young historian, very, very vibrant. She's writing children's books alongside writing, academic journals and books. So they are very important, but there's also the language issue that should be factored in there. I think it is important not only to write in English, because if you look at the use of English in this country, less than 20% of the population, black and white, actually use English. The vast majority of our people use indigenous languages. So we really need to take ourselves seriously as South Africans, seriously enough to actually, work on preserving our cultural languages. Then there was a question about colorism. Colorism really depends on whether you are looking at the society back then or today. Certainly, if you are looking at Balobedu society today, they are as much influenced by sort of these colonial notions of whiteness, where, being light-skinned, for example, because of its association with white people, it's seen as something privileged, something to be privileged, something that has power, and something that is also about aesthetics. So if you are light-skinned, you are assumed to be more attractive, especially women. Light-skinned women are beautiful. I think it tells us the extent to which we are still colonized, very much colonized. So Steve Biko's ideology of black is beautiful really still has a place in this society. It still needs to play its role. I think, we need to get back there. The further back you go in time, I don't think the lightness of the skin necessarily determined how attractive, how beautiful you are, because there are even idiomatic expressions that actually, speak very positively about the dark skin. So it does tell you that, the notions of light-skinnedness, for example, as expressed in Ryder Haggard's novel, She, it's really about colonialism and the power of whiteness in a colonial context. Then, if I could respond very briefly, it's very difficult. I mean, for me, Amabini's question was, what is inspiring? What is one inspiring aspect about the historical figure? I look at different figures and not just one figure. And all of them as female leaders, who stood their ground in a society, I mean, from the 1800s, that, is sort of patrilocal, right? And patriarchal. It does not mean that women in Bolobedu society in general, rule. In fact, in Bolobedu, it is the queen, the reign queen, who has the authority. But all her councillors are actually males, but her voice is actually listened to, because that's actually how it goes. Some scholars have said that, in fact, the Balobedi reign queens are honorary men. It is a concept that I completely disagree with, because it simply says that these women actually almost always rule in favor of women. But the social structure itself, even though it's sort of patriarchal, it's such that women are treated, or rather, let me not say now, but back in the past, in the way that they actually lived. And which was not only unique to Balobedu, but other societies around the time, from the 1800s or even earlier. As I indicated earlier on, the inequalities between men and women were not that vast. It is colonialism that actually brought that about. So I'm just inspired by the fact that you actually have this particular society where women, even though is women from sort of the ruling families, actually lead politically, lead in the political sphere, as well as in the ritual sphere. It's very difficult for me to pinpoint one of these women, but I can only talk about all these women.
Thanks, Professor Augusto.
Yeah, thank you very much for all of these questions. They are, each one could be probably a workshop by itself, but I'll just take, I guess there are about 4, and be as brief and therefore as incomplete and unsatisfactory as I can. I'll start with the children's book idea. It is such a great idea. I am a grandmother. I went around the corner to a bookshop, I forget the name now, Circle or something. It's in this thing called 27 Boxes over near Melville. I don't know who owns the shop, but I have never seen such an incredible display of children's books written by, for the most part, by South Africans, as near as I could tell, in both the national languages and in English. I, of course, hastened to buy far too many in English for my 3 little granddaughters. And the books are just marvelous. But I think that in general, of course, we need more. I think that the answer may lie in greater contact between those of us who write and tell and research history and young creatives. Because young, creative Black people just abound in the world, South Africa and all around. And I think maybe we need to think about translating some of the work that we do into a whole host of products, the children's books, but then videos and podcasts. I'm happy if you do a TikTok, I don't care, based on these kinds of things. And then there was the one that my son said to me one day, they are the mothers of the fathers of the 3 little granddaughters. Mom, you know these things you're writing about these women, you should make dolls. And I thought, yeah, why not? So I'm not going to make dolls, but if anyone wants to read about it and then decide to make a doll based on the historical character, that's good for me. Second question, or maybe it was the first one, is just the one dearest to my heart. I wish I could take a long time in answering about my native land. And thank you for pointing out that Martinique is the land of Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire. And what I found out when I started visiting Martinique is that Frantz Fanon had been taught by Aimé Césaire. Went off in a slightly different direction, but it's part of an African diasporic intellectual tradition that we need to know. I've been talking to some of my colleagues here, the Litsima colleagues, and they're explaining to me, and I forget which one, if he's sitting here, he's going to be mad at me. But Steve Biko didn't just spring from the forehead of Zeus, but there were writers in the Eastern Cape, way back in the 20th century, who he may have read or have heard about. So all these things about our genealogies, our intellectual genealogies, are also always important to mention. But on my native land, the reason why it would take a workshop for me to answer that, yes, I am in my native land right now, is because I was raised in a Pan-African home in the United States. And so from teenage, we were taught to think, anywhere there are Black people, that's your home. Your duty is to make yourself welcome there. Because just because it's your home, in theory, doesn't mean that you're going to act in such a way, integrate yourself in such a way, carry yourself in such a way that the people who are there will also think, yes, she has come home. So I've spent a lifetime trying to do that imperfectly. But I particularly feel that Southern Africa is my home because I lived in Tanzania, I lived in Angola, and I mean really lived more than 10 years in Angola during war, and then started coming to South Africa from 1994. And always, I go where I'm invited. I don't intrude. I don't drop in with my own project. If you ask me, and we agree, I will come. And I consider anywhere in Southern Africa to be my home. Even though, as you could tell, my isiZulu and whatever is not good, but my Kiswahili is very good, and my Portuguese is very good. So yes, I'm in my native land. It's a bit more complicated, but I want to answer in that way.
Thank you very much. You can
Should I
proceed.
stop? Should I go on?
Yes, sir.
Okay, let me, I don't know which of the various remaining ones are, because they're all so important. I have to thank my fellow, Litsema fellow, Frederick, for reminding us about Kikuyu and Mumbi. And when you were speaking, it reminded me of the book, I think it's the latest book by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who we all need to study and go back to all the time. But he tells that myth. And I read the story, and I mean, it's just amazing, these 9 women, and how important they are to shaping or defining a kind of belongingness, giving respect. I'm not going to answer the one about what I was inspired by the figures. I think it's fairly clear. Let me do the last one, and I want to refer to the question about colored women and colorism. This is one of the aspects that I think more Pan-African dialogue, what IPATC is trying to promote, the conversation part of it. We really need to dig deep into that because it varies. I'm sure it varies across Africa. I wouldn't be an expert in that, but I know it varies across the diaspora. So in the United States, for example, where people were enslaved, even if they had blonde hair and blue eyes, if they had a drop, so to say, of African blood, then the notion, the kind of social setting is a little bit different. If you go to a place like Brazil, I meet people that I know they're Black, but they're socially defined as white. And a lot of that is intertwined with class, class. They say money whitens in Brazil. So you can be very dark, but if you achieve a certain kind of social status, you are socially white and socially Black, or the reverse, socially Black. So I think it differs from African country to African country, and certainly from African diaspora situation to African diaspora situation. But I think that more conversation across Africa and the diaspora would be very important. One of the things that was important for me in South Africa was to spend a lot of time in Cape Town, the Cape Colony. And I realized, wait a minute, most people don't even think of South Africa as a slave colony. It was first a slave colony. Should be very clear. 1652, and what's his name? I can't remember his name, but Jan van Riebeck. And the first enslaved people that were brought to the Cape Colony, the first one was girls from Angola, because he specifically asked, and it's in the diaries, could you get me, asking one of his partners in kind of the Dutch colonial empire, I would like young girls from Angola, and he got them. Those were the first enslaved people. Then follow others from Southeast Asia, from Mozambique. And that story of the enslavement of people born of an Atlantic slave trade and an Indian Ocean slave trade, to me, is one of the most important to be told and to know more about. I can't know more about it than you would know, but I've done a lot of reading about it. And so I think that the dialogue around the diaspora with Africa about the question you raised can be very important. One that maybe people this side don't think of is that there's risen this notion now, especially 21st century, of Afro-Latinx or Afro-Latinas. So you get people in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Argentina, Uruguay, places that you would think or had been told these are white South African. They're not. All of them have a Black population, some of them the majority of the population. So I think the dialogue for the question that you ask should also be extended to them. What else did I want to say? Oh, I want to say a word about supporting Black women running for office. This is a conversation that Professor Zondi and another of my Litsema fellows and I have been talking about, because of the very interesting development in Brazil now with the current election. And we talk a lot about, Kenyan election, Brazilian election that's coming up. And I think it's the first time, or it's new, to be so concerted or systematic. But the Afro-Brazilians who are politically and socially active this time have banded together to support each other. And a lot of the new candidates are Black women. And so you've got your male candidates, your queer candidates, your trans women, your everybody banding together in a very interesting way to support the candidacy of these women. And I think that's a conversation that IPATC may be able to foster either before the election in Brazil or after. They have this campaign that's called Vamos Enegrecer o Parlamento. Let's blacken the Brazilian parliament. And that means no matter which party they're in, and if the candidate is a woman or the candidate is a man or it's not in your party, still there's this surge of support. So I think it's an important development in thinking about the support for Black women who are running for electoral office. I'll stop there.
Wow. 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 I can only just say wow, wow, wow. The time is a serious dictator in relation to what we can do in life. But it's such a dictator that it enables you have always great possibility. Time ends, but time continues. Time says we must cease here, but time also says conversation can always go on, even outside of here. That's the beauty of the continuous runningness of time. In my language, they say the sun set because it's going to rise. So the setting of the sun, not a conclusion. It's the beginning of a new cycle and all of that. And that is why the way we write Skiba Kiba sometimes, we don't conclude the paper we're writing. We simply say what we said because we think the paper is still going to continue for as long as we live because of the mysteries of life. At this point, I really just want to first to clap hands for the program director. You see this is serious. You did it indeed. I was joking, and you actually did it. At this point, I really want to invite Professor Sifiso Ndlovu, the editor of the book and the leader of SADET, that has produced now over 10 different volumes, all sorts of things, to conclude with us. And I would like in his conclusion to also answer the question that was left here, which is about people are asking when they do work, where do they mark pre? Where does the pre of the pre-colonial begin? Is it in different ages in different places, or there is a particular pre-colonial? So I'm going to ask him that when he gives a concluding remark, he also mentions that. And we will see you at lunch. Professor Ndlovu, you can give him a big hand. He's dressed to kill today. He's usually in tracksuits, and today he's like this. Professor Ndlovu, for the camera, I need you near here.
Okay.
You dressed very well today. You need to be in the camera, my brother.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. I have to promote my book. If I'm shabby, people will not take the book serious. So, as we said, it is available at Exclusive Books, Melrose Arc, and other. The whole volume book set is also available at UNISA Press, as most of you just see volume 9 and you suddenly think, where are the other 8 volumes? You can buy the whole book set from UNISA Press. You can visit their website, but at the same time, if it's convenient for you, Melrose Arc Exclusive Books will help you to purchase all the volumes. And I would like to thank them also for being with us here, from gracing the occasion. And I've seen that Professor Zondi has given out their contact details and their email address. You can contact them. But what I would like to say is that really this project, the South African Democracy Education Trust Project, is really the brainchild of President Mbeki. And it began in the year 2000. And we've been at it for the past 22 years. So I would like to say that we, together with my colleagues as scholars, researchers, and writers, we are not apologetic about the work that we are doing. And we are quite aware that we've hardly scratched the surface. And we're quite aware that our work is not necessarily definitive. And we're quite aware, Dr. Amma in the UK was just sent the message. This is not the final book in this series, volume 9. We're quite aware that there are equivalent queen mothers in Ghana in pre-colonial times who are also part of this series. So this is the first of many. This is SADET volume 9, part 1, focusing on this theme. There's going to be part 2, part 3, part 4, part 5. That is, if we do have money, sustaining this project has been a challenge. So, but as we said, we are not going to stop at anything. We are committed to such work. And as I said, we don't want to be affirmed by anyone out there, because we know that injustices have been done in our country in terms of the production of historical knowledge and in terms of, really sharing ideas as a nation. Before, we used to be told that we don't have a history. We do have a history. And at SADET, we're not saying that whatever we do, we're definitive. We're one of the many organizations that are trying to provide a solution of understanding our past and our history. And I would therefore like to thank the patron himself, President Mbeki, and also would like to thank the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, so the University of South Africa, because I work for both the University of South Africa and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank my colleague here, Professor Zondi, and his institute, because it's a collaborative initiative. Besides, Professor Zondi joined SADET in the year 2001, whilst he was working for Africa Institute of South Africa. The first volume of The Road to Democracy, he has a chapter, I think it's chapter 3. And the story how he joined us, how we went out to field work in Limpopo is another story. So with him, it's work in progress. We've been working with him. And actually the first volume also that we published, that includes our colleague, Prof. Kerry Acosta, it was on international solidarity. That's volume 5, part 3. They are co-authors. They're in the same book. You know, that's volume 5 and part 3. So I would like to thank the Institute for joining us, and there are so many opportunities, you know, that we will try and take advantage of. And also, I would like to thank the National Institute of Human and Social Sciences for really helping us and providing the funding. But the most important people I would like to thank are the authors. You know, are the authors. I've been working for this project for 22 years. I've never had an opportunity to thank all the authors. And we have about more than 120 networks all over the world. All over the world. Whether in Cuba, in China, in India, in the US, in Europe, Egypt, you name it, Tanzania, Mozambique, Lesotho, Swaziland, Zambia. That's how our network works. And they are so committed that I never ever thought that I'll be able to keep this network going for so many years. And the irony of it, this is the first ever sort of meeting of authors presenting their work at SADET. So for 22 years, I've never even had an opportunity to say thank you for the support, for the fact that I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them with us here in this room. I'm really blessed. I'm really blessed. No. Without them, there is no content. Without them, there is no SADET. And they really support me. Some people make a mistake. They think I am SADET. I am not SADET. No. SADET is owned by the authors from all over the world. And that is why I'm deciding to take this opportunity to say, really, thanks a million, and the struggle still continues. As I speak, I'm busy with volume 10, which will be out by the end of this year. I counted about 5 authors. There's a 6th one with his hand on his chin, Dr. Noel Solani. So it's an added blessing for me. And I'm saying, colleagues, as usual, I'll come back to you. And what I like, all of you, I don't have much to say. I just issue an instruction. And it's less than 5 minutes talk. And what's so interesting, you know, my colleagues are so clued up. They don't want me to read them an essay or an abstract or whatever, because I think we're traveling in the same space, because we know that we've got so much to do, that it's like what Dr. Tisani was saying, that she has so much, you know, she's done so much work. And when it comes to publishing, she struggles. So it seems as if when I have a chat with her, I've offered her a solution in terms of whatever she wanted to do. And in a sense, I don't even have to read her a thesis, because by the time I'm in my 5th minute, she's already understood, you know, that whatever you are proposing to me has to be done. And I must say the book is amazing, and I'm quite aware that I'm one of the authors, but as in most cases, I cannot be an editor-in-chief and an author. I have to choose which one. So today I chose to be an editor-in-chief, so that's why I was not presenting my work. And I'm saying to them also, we are going to think about the second volume. We are going to do it. And I do hear people out there, they want to turn it into multimedia in various forms. People who have ideas are also welcome to come and discuss those issues with me. And simply be turned into a film project or whatever, that's acceptable. But I'll cut a long story short, and being happy, having thanked the authors as the driver of this project, we can now go and have lunch and food. And thank you, Professor Ndawe, again. I said Sonda. Yeah. Oh, yes. I think I did a mistake when I was thanking the institution. I gave this male all the powers to take the glory. Whilst we were not dealing with him. We were dealing with Miss Nompumelelo Ndawonde. She was the one really I should have thanked. No. So I just want to thank her. You know, she did a great job, you know, and together with her colleagues. Thanks for everything.
Thank you very much. This editor is thinking he's editing me too, because I'm saying continue. I don't want to come back. They've already clapped hands for me. I don't want them to clap hands again. No, thank you very much. There we wrap it. That will be good. It's recorded, so if you need a recording, we'll organize it, and we look forward to seeing you again.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.